Welcome in Nashua and beyond to the Picker's Corner. I'm Scott, your host from Picker's Paradise here in Nashua. And as I alluded to last time, the first thing we're going to talk about here is this nice little axe hatchet. As I was saying last time, I actually found this here in Nashua at a yard sale on a Sunday, probably about a month ago, so middle of the summer. Now, the reason, we'll talk a little bit about the picking aspect first before we get into the history of this piece. Now, when it comes to picking and stuff like this, when I usually see something that looks like old tools, like this axe does, typically you can tell just by the construction of it. It has like a medallion head here, kind of. And so one of the things that I do is I always look for markings. So if I can see any kind of stamping or marking on it, that is the most important thing, because without a name, it's just an axe and it's just a piece of metal. What I find is that the value of things really comes from knowing the maker and the story that goes along with it. So when I find pieces like this in the field, the first thing I look for, I try to, wipe it down a little bit. This thing was covered with rust even more than it is now. So I'll wipe it down and try to see if I can find or feel or see any markings of any kind, letters, numbers, that type of thing. So I did on this piece. And the great thing about finding stuff at yard sales is that usually the prices are so cheap that it doesn't matter if I spent a few bucks on this and I end up cleaning it up, I can't figure out what it is, or it doesn't have the markings I needed to have on there to be able to tell what it was. If it just said something like guaranteed cast steel, something that was generic to a lot of makers back in the day in the late 1800s, that I wouldn't know exactly where this thing came from. But I lucked out this time. I did end up getting it. I got it home. I started cleaning it up. Now, guaranteed cast steel was one of the things I saw in there first, because this thing has been used, as you can see. There's lots of wear to the back side of it, which is actually where the stamping was, right here at the top. But I was lucky enough to be able to find enough letters on here to be able to start doing some searches and end up finding where this thing was made. It was actually stamped Underhill, Edge Tool Company, guaranteed cast steel. Now, Underhill Tool Company, we'll talk about that more, but we'll first start talking about the Underhills themselves. The Underhills were a tool-making family, or clan actually, that got its start here in Chester, New Hampshire, around the time of the Civil War, the Revolutionary War back in the 1770s. So they've been tool makers for a long time. Now, that was Josiah Hill back in the day, and if you read Robert E. Nelson's 1999 Directory of American Toolmakers, which is basically a who's who of toolmakers, especially prior to 1900, you'll find listings of about 19 different Underhills that were making tools here in the Merrimack River watershed area in New Hampshire. So the most notable of all the Underhills was a guy named George Underhill. And so back in the 1820s, he opened his forge in Chester, New Hampshire. Now, this forge in Chester, New Hampshire, as I was reading on one of the tool chat rooms where I found some information on Underhill, one of the gentlemen who's actually a New Hampshire native was talking about how the remnants, the foundation and things for this original forge from George Underhill back in the 1820s is actually still in the woods in Chester off of, I think he said, what was it, off of Route 121. Now, before you all go start looking through the woods, make sure you're not trespassing on private property. You get landowner's permission before you go out. And then when you're out on sites, especially historical ones, which this one probably could be considered, please leave it better than you found it. Thanks. And so George started making those tools. He actually expanded in 1835. He bought a mill building over in Auburn, adjacent to Chester, and he started making tools there as well. So he had two forges going by the time the 1840s rolled around. Now in the 1840s, around 1840, that's when George opened his first forge here in Nashua. Now that was on Water Street, according to the records, and it is kind of the first site he had here in Nashua and would eventually become the Nashua Edge Tool Company. So fast forward a little bit more, back over to the 1850s. Around 1852, the Nashua Edge Tool Company is actually created, and he moves operations from Water Street over to the Crown Hill area. Now, the Crown Hill area in Nashua, if you kind of look at a map and you take the top border as East Hollis Street, the western border as Main Street, the southern border as the beginning of Ald Street, and the eastern border as the river, that's basically the Crown Hill area you got there. So at that time in the 1850s, there was absolutely pretty much nothing over there in the Crown Hill area. So it was a great place for him and his other people that created the company with him, his partners in the company, Mr. John Gage and a few others. So Mr. Underhill basically bought up all the land on Crown Hill. And it basically became a little area that they started calling Edgeville, or the Edgeville district, because basically the people that ended up building homes there or moving into homes that were built there for them were a lot of the employees of the Edge Tool Company there in Crown Hill. So 1852, they get started. They actually become quite popular. The business is growing like crazy. In the 1850s, George also closes his original forge in Chester. So the only thing he's got running now is Auburn, which there isn't a whole lot of information on the Auburn forge. It might have been something relatively small that didn't last very long. I wasn't able to get too great information on that one. But in Nashua, so in 1852, they're off and running. By the time 1879 rolls around, they're a big company. They're putting out ads in the local newspapers looking for hardwood to be able to make handles and things like that to keep the Edge Tool Company going. And in 1879, they actually purchased the Amoskeag Axe Company, which is a local rival manufacturer. So they keep growing and expanding, and then in 1890, everything just comes to an end. They end up getting bought out by the American Axe and Tool Company, which is basically a conglomerate, not a conglomerate of sorts, but an owner of multiple axe companies. So they also own the Douglas Tool Company down in Douglas, Massachusetts. So the Nashua plant was permanently closed once the sale took place, and all of the equipment, the forges, were all moved down to Douglas, Mass, and were used by the Douglas Tool Company. Now, one of the very interesting things about Underhill Tools is that they gained some notoriety during the Lizzie Borden murder trial down in Fall River, Massachusetts. So I'm not sure how familiar you all are with the Lizzie Borden murders. She was accused of murdering her stepmother and her father with a hatchet-type axe, probably something that looked like this. And they actually ended up putting into evidence for the trial an axe head that did not have a handle on it, because the axe was actually found in the basement with some other axes, and this one looked like it was recently cleaned compared to all the others, and it was also missing the handle. The supposition there being is that she removed the handle because it was covered in blood and ended up burning the handle so that just the axe head was remaining. So it's a little bit of interesting history, in addition to the fact that this hatchet head here was probably made in Nashua sometime between 1840 and 1890. I'm leaning a little bit more towards the 1890s because of the guaranteed steel and the way that the axe head was actually made. It's a little bit more industrialized. So, little interesting piece of Nashua history, piece of history about an interesting murder trial that there was multiple TV shows, movies made about. So yeah, just a cool piece all around. And of course, as you can see, one thing I forgot to add is that the handle on this one is most definitely replaced. Someone had used this to a point where the original handle is no longer on it, which isn't surprising because it's probably at least 130 or 150 years old. It's got a more modern type hammer handle on it now with some extra pieces of wood splints in there. So we'll move on. The other pieces I brought for you today and things that I can talk about with you are some Fiesta ware. Now, Fiesta ware is something that a lot of people are somewhat familiar with. You see it in a lot of vintage and antique shops, and you also see it out in places where you buy new goods. They are still manufacturing, and we will get to all that in a moment. But first, we'll start off at the beginning. So Fiesta ware is actually just a line of pottery from the Homer Laughlin China Company. Now, it was introduced for the first time back at a trade show at the Pittsburgh China and Glass Show in 1936, and it was immediately a hit. The original lineup of Fiesta was actually created by a man named Frederick Hurton Reed. Now, Frederick Hurton Reed was the Homer Laughlin Company's design director from 1927 to 1942. And 1942 was also, unfortunately, the year of his death. So he basically brought the Homer Laughlin Company into the forefront of retail dinnerware with some of his designs. A lot of his most famous designs are very Art Deco, much like this line of Fiesta ware that he created. Now, it was an immediate hit. So within the first 2 years of it being introduced to the market in 1936, within 2 years it had sold over 1 million pieces of pottery out of that line. So in those times, that's a lot of pottery. There were 5 original colors. There was red, which I have a piece here. There was yellow, cobalt blue, green, ivory, which is this whitish, yellowish piece here. And they started introducing more colors as soon as 1937, the second year of production. And in that time, they introduced a turquoise, which is this blue here. And then over the years, they started introducing some pastel colors in the 1950s. And in the 1960s and 70s, they did more bright and earthen tones again. So Fiesta was retired in 1972 after 37 years of production. And in that time, they had used over, So in 1985, so they retired the line in 1972. It went out of favor, and it just was not as popular as it used to be. So they retired the line, and they started making it again in 1985 when they were approached by Bloomingdale's, who was interested in bringing back the bright colors and things like that, because the original Fiesta ware was starting to gain a little bit more favor, and people were starting to go back to a little bit of the Art Deco style as well. So a year later, in 1986, with an agreement between Bloomingdale's and the Homer Laughlin Company, Fiesta ware was started in production again. So over the years, they started adding more and more colors. To date, I believe there is about 47 to 50 different colors that they've created for the Fiesta ware line. As I said, there were about 6 different colors as of 1930. They added 5 more in the 50s, 3 more in the 60s. So before they went out of business, they had about 14, or before they stopped the production line in 1972, they had about 14 different colors that they had to their repertoire. So as you can see, the difference between the 47 to 50 now and the 14 originals, there was a lot more added since the reproduction started, or since the production started back up again in the 1980s. In the 1980s, they brought back 4 of the original colors, and they also added in 4 new ones. The 90s saw 7 more colors added, the 2000s saw a dozen more added, and the 2010s saw another 10 added. I'm not sure if they've started releasing any new 2020 colors or anything like that, but I'm sure that they probably will if they keep the line going. Now, one of the more interesting colors associated with Fiesta wear is this red. Now, it's not like you'd think of a traditional red, it's more of an orange red. And the way that they actually got this color was by using uranium. Now, when we talked about the uranium glass a few weeks ago, I was mentioning that the color of the uranium is actually like an orange-yellow kind of like. So when they originally made the uranium glass, it had a yellowish look to it. So the yellow and the different uranium oxides that they use in this one actually helped get this red or orange color. Now this actually picked up the nickname of radioactive red or atomic red back in the days in the 1950s, pretty much, or 1940s and 50s, when the color actually became under scrutiny because of the uranium used in it. Because as we discussed again with the uranium glass, once the 1940s hit and World War II was going, the creation of the Atomic Energy Commission was created, and to do anything with any kind of radioactive materials, you needed to have licensing from that entity. So the production of the radioactive red, which started in 1936, actually was paused in 1943 because of these licensing and availability issues. It didn't come back again until 1959, when the company was again able to acquire the uranium that it needed. Now, the amount of active radioactive material in there, originally from the ones from 1936 to 1943, was about 0.7% of the uranium that was actually in the product. And when it came back online for production in 1959, it had actually been dropped all the way down to 0.2%. They changed up the uranium mixture. It had less U-235 in it and more U-238, but that's neither here nor there. So they actually produced this again from 1959 up until the pause in manufacturing in 1972. It is, without a Geiger counter, it is very difficult to tell the difference between the two manufacturing periods for this color. So it's basically impossible, unless you have a Geiger counter. Now, the Fiesta wear, a lot of it has some markings on it, and the way that you identify it is actually by the concentric rings on the pieces. As you can see, not all of them have concentric rings, and that was one of the reasons why I brought this syrup jar with me today. But a lot of them did have markings in the bottom that were pressed in, Fiesta, made in USA, with the Homer Laughlin sign symbol at the top. So it's the easiest, or I should say the best way to be able to identify anything is through the original catalogs. The good news is that the Homer Laughlin company that made this is still around, and a lot of their items that they catalogs, things like that, are still available online, and there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of information you can find out there as well. So the concentric lines and the Art Deco style is one way to identify it. There's also pieces that have more of a ink stamp on it. This one says Genuine Fiesta, HLC, HL Co, USA. And you can also tell the older pieces from the newer pieces too by the manufacturing style of the older pieces. Now these older pieces have markings here. You can see on this saucer a little bit. It has some white marks around the edges of the piece. Now these white marks where there is no glaze, that's where the piece was actually sat to be fired. You don't see a whole lot of this in the modern pieces. And the fact that some of them also have what they call a dry bottom. So there is not, like there is on this saucer, there is not the glaze all the way around the piece on the bottom. So this is actually sat as it was made. Now, the Homer Laughlin company and the Fiesta lines, they didn't just make tableware. These were utilitarian pieces for the most part. They were sold a lot through different 5 and dime stores at the time and other home goods stores. And as you can see here, again, with this demi-tasse coffee pot, you have a stamped Fiesta in there, and again, a relatively dry bottom. Signs it is an older piece. Also the color, and as I said, going through the old catalogs, you can tell which pieces were made what years. It really narrows down the time periods for pieces that you find, because different pieces like this demi-tasse was only made for a few years, and then they moved on. They did not make this style anymore after a few years worth of production. And the same thing with the syrup jar. The most valuable pieces you'll find in the Fiesta lines are the ones that were made only for short periods of time and had colors that were more desirable. Now, talking about the Homer Laughlin company that made these pieces in general. Now, Homer Laughlin has been a company in business making pottery, dinnerware for over 150 years now. They started back in 1871 when it was Laughlin Pottery, which was started by 2 brothers, Homer, who became the namesake of the company for most of the company's history, and his brother Shakespeare. It would have been interesting if I was the other way around and it would have been the Shakespeare Pottery Company. But I digress. So they started the company back in East Liverpool, Ohio. And it was kind of interesting going back and reading about the history, because the area in East Liverpool where they were in Ohio on the Ohio River, literally right on the Ohio River, was a home for pottery making, yellowware pottery making, back in the 1840s until the 1870s when these brothers tried to give it a hand. So they actually started their business because the town of East Liverpool was giving the, who was it? It was the City Council of East Liverpool was offering $5,000 grant basically to any company that wanted to start producing, instead of yellowware, whiteware china. So the whiteware china that was coming out of Europe, mostly England and things like that, was gaining great notoriety. The yellowware pottery, which was viewed as a little bit cheaper, was starting to hit the decline. And the folks of East Liverpool saw this happening, and their city council decided to offer $5,000. The Laughlin brothers decided it was their chance, so they took the money and they started up a 2-kiln operation in East Liverpool in 1873, right on the Ohio River banks. So by 1876, they had it down to a science, apparently, because for the U.S. Centennial Celebration or Expo in Philadelphia, the Laughlin Brothers China Company actually won the best whiteware at the exposition. So from 3 years from their start, they were already best in show in the United States, apparently. But I guess that wasn't good enough for Shakespeare, because he kind of exited stage left, leaving Homer by himself. And thus, the Homer Laughlin China Works was created. And fast forwarding 20 more years, Homer had run the company. It had been a great success. He sold it off to the Wells and Aaron families, and they actually have run the company pretty much up to current date. That family has been in it for 3 generations at least. Now, so they really accelerated the growth when these 2 new owners took over. Homer had run it as a life love, and the 2 new owners, who were both investors, took it on and started accelerating the growth. In 1899, only 2 years after their purchase, they opened a second plant, and 4 years after that, a third plant in East Liverpool. So now they had 3 operations running before just after 1900. Now in 1902, the Homer Laughlin Company decided that they needed to expand further than what East Liverpool could provide them. So this was a really interesting strategy, I thought. They literally bought land on the other side of the Ohio River from where East Liverpool was, and from this Newell family, and it was technically West Virginia on the other side of the river. So they bought this large tract of land in West Virginia from this Newell family, ended up calling it Newell, West Virginia, and pretty much built their own town across the river from where their current plants were. Built a bridge to go over the river to be able to access their new town that they had just built with new manufacturing facilities that they were looking to build. So 1905, 1906 time frame, plant number 4, which was actually in Newell, starts construction. And it actually, at the time it was built, was the largest pottery plant in the world. So right here in the United States, we had the largest pottery plant made by the Homer Laughlin Company. Now, the combined capacity of the 4 plants, once they got all 4 up and running, they could produce 300,000 pieces of pottery a day. So it was much more than the little operation started by 2 brothers in the 1870s at that point. And we'll pick up the story next time. We'll talk about Homer Laughlin in the 1900s into today. So thank you all very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you next time.